Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to episode 15 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we're talking about Data East, which might be a popular name if you were very popular in the arcades. If you frequented arcades, you might recognize Data East, but outside of that, there's really not that much that they did. So realistically, I was on the fence about either making this a Ready Go Gaming Show special episode or make it a full up episode. I think we had enough information to make it a full Ready Go Gaming show episode, and considering that this is the last major episode this season before the finale, I figured we could do something interesting, something that people might know. So, I'm not doing it alone. I will be talking on this episode, but again, I'm not doing it alone. I have Ace Gaming LPs and Wandermaven. Both of them are fantastic streamers. Ace is somebody I've known for going on 2 years now. Great dude. He's an associate producer for the Ready Go Gaming Show. He streams whenever he can. He has a new job, which makes it a little bit more difficult for him to stream whenever he can, but he still does it, and that's awesome, right? I love him to death. He's a great guy. He's got a great voice, and he's one of the more veteran members of the show. He's done, I think, 4 episodes. Right off the top of my head, I can't remember which ones they are, but he's done plenty of them. The next streamer, next guest speaker, is Wandermaven, who streams occasionally. He likes to read books on stream. He loves to play pretty much whatever. Me and him kind of have the same wavelength when it comes to shoot 'em ups, horizontal and vertical. That's something that I kind of clicked with him on. Great streamer, and this is his freshman episode, right? So you have both of our guest speakers, including myself. Sit back, relax, get ready to learn a little bit about some Data East.
There are many different companies out there that have had a massive impact on the dynamics of video gaming. Off the top of my head, I can name about 10. Atari, Activision, Acclaim, Electronic Arts, you get the picture. I can't count past 4, but that is neither here nor there. We're not here to talk about my difficulty with advanced arithmetic, but instead to talk about a company that started all the way back in 1976 by a man named Tetsuo Fukuda. Fukuda wanted to create business that would parallel something that was starting to gain in popularity, arcade titles. The name of the company? Data East. Atari had released Pong in 1972. Taito was starting to stick their necks out with Speed Race. Basically what was going on was that a golden age was on the horizon. Fukuda wanted to create something unique, an arcade system where owners could change the tapes inside of arcades. This would mitigate the need for arcade owners to buy new cabinets.
But hey, if you're going to make an arcade system, why not just, make your own game too? Which they did with the 1977 Jacklot, which was a metal game. Now, I'm not overly keen on the concept of gambling in Japan, but luckily, we have someone who is.
Metal games are simple. You put money into a machine and get a certain amount of metals in return. Say 30 metals for $1. You can then go put those metals into a metal game to try to win more metals. Metal games take various shapes and sizes, from standard things like slot machines and video poker to more complex stuff. For example, I'm sure some of you are familiar with coin pusher machines from carnivals, where you put tokens in and try to get the machine to knock more tokens out. Some of the latest metal games in Japan are straight up actual video games where you pay with metals to play. Essentially, it's a lot like pachinko except with no end prize. You get all the excitement of winning big, but your prize is more tokens that can't be spent on anything. You just get to keep playing games. At the end of the day, you can put your tokens into a token bank machine. You create an account with your thumbprint as your password and can insert or withdraw tokens from your account. But there's a catch. If you don't use your tokens for 30 days, they all expire. It is like gambling light with all the joy feelings of gambling classic, but less guilt and addiction. If you find a game you're decent at, you can wind up with a way to entertain yourself for free for quite some time.
The next title they would release would be Super Break, the first video game that was released in arcades by Data East. Wasn't a weird concept that needs to be explained by a third party. In fact, from the 70s all the way to the 80s, through the golden age of gaming, Data East, or Deco as you might sometimes see them, were kicking ass, releasing arcade titles such as Astro Fighter, Mad Alien, Ninja, Terranian, more. But we are starting to bleed into the 80s, so let's focus more on the late 70s, right before the turn of the decade. Data East decided to open a US division to directly compete with 2 other very strong Japanese competitors who were doing the same, Taito and Sega. If you are unaware of those 2 companies, you might have lived under a rock. Taito brought us the most successful arcade game of its time, Space Invaders. Sega? Well, Sega just stole the shit out of everyone else's ideas and ran with them. Why do your own work when you can just copy someone else's homework, am I right?
And you remember when we talked about the idea of changing out games in a cabinet? This was that idea. The DECO cassette system. Now there were roughly 106 Data East arcade games, and this little cassette system was applicable to 48 of them. So all in all, seems like a good idea, right? Well, no. Unfortunately, because these games were stored on audio cassettes, they would demagnetize easily, and that pretty much killed the concept. But worry not, SNK would figure it out in the 90s. Oh, want to know another unique fact? Technos, the people who brought us the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun series, was created by 3 members who left Data East in 1981. And yes, they left on good terms. This led to some unique partnerships. But it's time to hop into the 80s, a period where Data East thrived.
Smell that? It's the golden age of the arcade, bright and buttery and happy. Smell that? That's the video game crash of 1983. See this? This is Data East not giving a single fuck about anything. Why? Because Data East only published and developed titles for the arcade, and by the time the market saturation had run its course, there was literally nothing Data East had to worry about. Surviving the crash let them get into talks with Nintendo to develop titles for their fancy new Famicom in 1985. Their first jump into the home console market? B-Wings, a Japanese arcade title that was exclusively ported to the Famicom. There are a few titles that would be that way, but the true double dipping and money making was due to the fact that Data East was pushing on 2 fronts. They were relevant in the arcades in the late 80s. You might recall titles such as Bump and Jump, Burger Time, or even Carnob, all of which were massively successful. What happened in the 80s if you had badass arcade games? Well, people wanted to port them. Data East handled the Famicom and NES ports of many of their popular arcade titles, but they allowed licensing for the rest. Smart move if you ask me.
Data East was killing it. As we progressed through the 80s, Data East's influence hopped to the TurboGrafx-16. It also hopped on the Game Boy, Genesis, the WonderSwan, PlayStation, Saturn, yada yada yada. You get the idea. In other words, they had badass games in the arcade, and they were licensing their titles out for literally every console since the 80s. But you know what else they were doing? Pinball. From 1987 to 1994, they were making badass pinball games. This was the result of a purchase agreement from Stern Electronics. Not to break off topic, but it's time for a quick pinball lesson. Pinball started being popular during the times of cavemen. They used to chunk rocks at each other and then make growling noises. And holy shit, high score, right? Well, no. But if you're my age, going back and talking about the history of these machines makes it feel like pinball is ancient. Now, I'm not going to go back to the early origins of pinball because that would be in 1643 and we don't have time to go that far back. So instead, let's focus on the 1930s. Pinball and marble games were doing well. The main man was David Gottlieb. He invented Baffle Ball, which sold 50,000 units. Gottlieb started outsourcing to people such as Raymond Maloney, who wanted to sell Baffle Ball, but got pissed and founded Lion Manufacturing and released Ballyhoo. It was stupid successful. This led to a name change from Lion Manufacturing to Bally. With us so far?
So we have Gottlieb and Bally, but there's someone else you need to know. Harry Williams. He's the guy who founded Williams Manufacturing and developed Defender and Joust. And in the 70s, we had the Stern family who purchased Chicago Coin and rebranded as Stern Enterprises. But once the 80s rolled around, we lost quite a few of the OG companies. Stern opened in the 70s and died in the 80s. Bally was popular up until the late 80s and sold all their assets to Williams. And Capcom and Sega were on the horizon. So, here we are in the early 90s, the digital age, if you will. Capcom is around kicking ass. Alvin Gottlieb formed his own company, and Gary Stern was a co-founder of Williams, created Data East Pinball, and now you're all caught up. Earlier, we mentioned that Data East's pinball experience was badass. Look, I'm not talking about kind of badass. No, I'm saying they were fucking pioneers. Data East is the reason why stereo sound came to be in the world of pinball with Laser War. They brought the dot matrix to the industry. That's right. This little screen right here, see this? That's credited to Data East. And the smaller version was popular on Checkpoint, released in 1991, and the massive-ass dot matrix.
It started with Maverick in 1994. People loved these machines, and Data East was racking in tons of money by making promotional deals with popular brands at the time. When we say brands, we mean pinball machines tied to Guns N' Roses, Back to the Future, The Simpsons, Lethal Weapon, and more. And then just like that, it was all over. Pinball was a roller coaster market. It was strong in the 50s to the 60s, died, had another resurgence, and ultimately died again as arcades became a memory of the past. It's the turn of the 90s. The home console market was just doing too well. Data East Pinball sold their assets to Sega and indicated a slow downfall for Data East as a company. Pinball was gone, and while Data East was still developing games in the mid-90s, the only titles that were well known were games like Karnov's Revenge, Tattoo Assassins, and a few other PS1 titles. They needed money to survive. Outside of video games, Data East was working on creating other electronics. Remember? Data East was, in all intents and purposes, an electronics company, not just another video game company. Some of their creations included radio transmission equipment, electrocardiograms for ambulances, and the DataFax, which was considered the world's first portable fax machine. But with most companies from this era, the damage was done. Video games are a very lucrative market. If you don't do it right, you just get pushed out. Sega is a prime example of this, a powerhouse company that simply made the wrong move, made the wrong gamble, and lost it all. I mean, they're still around, but not nearly in the capacity that they were in the 90s. By 1996, Data East's American component was liquidated. Their two final games would be DEFCON 5 and Creature Shock Special Edition. By 1998, the Japanese side of things had a deficit of about 3.3 billion yen. That's roughly $49,518,755.24 if you're accounting for inflation. With such a large amount of debt and them only being able to get a few side gigs, Data East declared bankruptcy officially in 2003. In the end, Data East was just a memory of the past. The creator, Tetsuo Fukuda, would go on to be the chairman for Urima, who developed software for medical applications. But what happened to all of the assets for Data East? Well, they were broken up among various companies. We'll be covering most of those well-known franchises, but it's important to know where all of the assets went. Let's begin.
Arc System Works is a well-known video game development company that has been massively popular in the later years for work on BlazBlue as well as Guilty Gear. But the important thing to know that is in 2015, they purchased all the rights to the Kunio-kun and Double Dragon franchises for WorkJam. In 2017, they got the rights to a bunch of other franchises Data East worked on, namely Jake Hunter, which is a mystery adventure series with 45 entries between the Famicom Disk System to the mobile ports and the 3DS. Avid is a little bit more difficult to talk about. From what we know, it was made by former Technos employees. So imagine this. 3 Data East employees leave to form Technos, and former Technos employees create Avid. Sometimes it's known as Avid Niigata. They made some interesting games, but most of them were done with other fantastic companies. For example, X-Men Mutant Wars and Blade with HAL Corporation, and some other older PS1 titles. They're hard to find out about, so if you want to search for them, be prepared to climb the mountain to find the Oracle, because information about them is not easily accessible.
Createch. This company was created by Hiroshi Miyaoka in 1988. I hope I'm not slaying that, I'm just a boy. And was well known for making Metal Max, which was a Japanese exclusive RPG series up until 2006 with science fiction elements. Metal Max started on the Famicom, and there were 3 more games before Metal Saga for the PS2, which was published by Atlus. Once Data East kicked the bucket, Createch worked with Success Company to make the Metal Saga line due to copyright issues for 3 titles until the name was changed back, courtesy of a fuck ton of money. True story. But they didn't retain it. Another company called Katakawa Games ended up buying the rights to Metal Max. D4 Enterprise is a Japanese publishing company like Acclaim. Their first game was developed by Compile, which you might not recognize, but if you've ever played this game, you might recognize them. Puyo Puyo. Puyo Puyo has its own cultural relevance in the gaming market. Recently, Sega has come to own Puyo Puyo, but D4 published other titles too, like literally every fucking shoot 'em up by Konami, such as Xanac, Gradius, Gradius 2, as well as Parodius. The important relationship with Data East is that they purchased the game rights to license RoboCop titles for the arcade, NES, as well as the PC. Titus Software bought the rights from Data East, but they also made the monstrosity of RoboCop New Crisis. Yeah. At that point, it was pretty clear they didn't have a fucking clue how to make games in the early 2000s, which led to D4 Enterprise buying back the rights to RoboCop. And you know, sometimes it just be like that. It's funny.
You know what a lot of people overlook? The rights to game music. You probably know the names of the composers that kicked ass in the video game composition world. Koji Kondo, Nobuo Uematsu, Yasunori Mitsuda, David Wise, the works. Well, Gameadelic was the audio engineering department of Data East. Think of them as an in-house band. The rights to Data East songs? They own them. That's it. Oh boy. G-Mode. You like mobile games? Well, they make mobile games. Like a metric fuck ton of mobile games. When you think of who owns most Data East's assets, there is only one step higher: the people who bought out G-Mode and made them a subsidiary. Marvelous. Marvelous is another one of those massive ass companies that buys out everyone in Japan. How do they relate to Data East? I'm talking Burger Time, Cobra Command, Dunk Dream 95, Bloody Wolf, Act Fancer, you name it, they own it, including Joe and Mac. The big ones they don't own are RoboCop, which we already explained, Windjammers, Metal Max, and Karnov. We'll cover that last one in a moment.
Once Data East went under the water, Idea Factory was what was left. Recently, they've done a lot of work with Compile. Remember the Puyo Puyo peeps? Yeah, well, that's about it. This company is a media conglomerate like Vivendi. They own tons of film, book, and other various publication medias. For some weird reason, they decided to obtain the rights to Mad Max from Createch. Basically, they do leasing now. Whatever makes money, right?
Paon. Remember these guys? We talked about them in the Mario episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show. These folks made Donkey Kong King of Swing, DK Jungle Climber, and Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. Want to take a wild guess what the team is made of? Former Data East employees. You can't make this shit up. So, what is interesting is that the fine folks at Paon have the second largest collection of Data East assets. These include Karnov, Chelnov, Windjammers, and a few other franchises. Citron label. When you have musicians, or more importantly, an in-house band, you need somebody to publish those soundtracks. That's what these folks did. If there was a video game that generated an album, then these were the guys that had something to do with it. Like the soundtrack for Ace Combat 4, for example. Remember Jet Set Radio Future? They did the soundtrack publishing for that as well. Fun stuff.
Oh boy. SNK. Nice to see them again. This is Fortefyre's favorite company. Oh man. Terrifying. I take that back. Anyway, SNK was responsible for allowing Data East to develop a bunch of games onto the Neo Geo. These games include
Hey,
What the
no,
fuck?
no, not without me. Give me that microphone. Give it. I swear to all that is holy. Give me the goddamn microphone. Power pinch.
That's my elbow. Why are you pinching my elbow?
If you're hearing this, I won. It was a lengthy battle, but my piercing gaze and sultry voice won this time. Okay, back to business. So the Neo Geo was a major console during the 90s, and even more so, a major presence in the arcade spectrum. All the popular titles we knew and loved, such as Metal Slug, Fatal Fury, Blazing Star, The King of Fighters, you name it, it was there. Now, a mass majority of these titles for the AES, MVS, and CD were made by the three in-house companies that were subsidiaries for SNK, ADK, Noise Factory, and Nazca Corporation. But there were some games that weren't tied to SNK at all. For example, King of Fighters 2001 was made by Eolith and Breezasoft. or Matrimele that had input from Atlas. There were roughly 5 titles in the Neo Geo library that were made by Data East. The first was Karnov's Revenge. Talk about that later, as Karnov is a major franchise. But the one game, yes, the one game that stood above the rest is Windjammers. Genus, flying power disc. Species, fucking awesome. Imagine if Pong met the glistening sweat of this guy. El Biagi, which is Italian for sexy man meat. Look at this guy. S. Miller. What's his first name? Doesn't fucking matter. His skills speak for himself. Well, not really. He's a beginning character, but that is not the point. Windjammers is one of the coolest arcade games that you could play against your friend and is one of the most successful Data East Neo Geo titles. And for a reason. It's genuinely fun, and you're doing yourself a disservice if you aren't playing it. Windjammers! It's like jamming the wind, whatever that means.
Remember earlier when I gave you a brief history of pinball? While Stern Electronics isn't around anymore, Stern Pinball is very much around. Essentially, when Data East sold their pinball assets to Sega, Sega in turn sold the assets to Stern Pinball. In fact, one of the more well-known Data East pinball designers, John Borg, works alongside of all the designers of Stern Pinball machines. The last 2 companies consisted of development and publishing for various titles. Wood Place managed the arcade development and licensed the titles Fire Trap and Ring King, but they both kind of suck. Work Jam was the company to acquire the rights to Jake Hunter before they were given to Arc System Works. Also, they consist of former Data East members. And those were all the subsidiaries that had something to do in some way, shape, or form with the future of Data East. We didn't name them all. Some of them existed by association, but we figured it would be cool to touch on where these cherished franchises ended up. Now, let's talk about some of the franchises that made Data East a household name. Remember, Data East was an arcade developer, so there are a fuck ton of arcade games. We are not going to cover them all, but we will take a look at the more popular ones.
Oh boy. BDDN, also known as Bad Dudes on the NES and Dragon Ninja on the Famicom. This was a beat-em-up title created by Data East in 1998. It was ported to the NES and Famicom, just as we said, and it was a massive hit in the arcades. What happens when something is a big deal in the arcades? A metric fuck ton of ports, that's what. Look, this game was on the ZX Spectrum, the MSX, the DOS, the Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, even the Apple II. Yeah, wrap your head around that one. If they can run Doom on a calculator, I'm pretty sure they can run this game. Look, the plot is simple. Ronald Reagan is abducted by some goon-ass called Dragon Ninja. The Secret Service is losing their goddamn minds to go find these 2 bad dudes who like to get into street fights to go rescue the president. Yes, this is a thing. This is the actual plot. After you rescue the president, you go and get hamburgers with the president. This game was one of the most successful arcade titles in 1998 and received universal acclaim. But unless you were live in the arcades during that time, you might not have heard of it. It did generate a sequel with Crude Busters in the arcade and 2 Crude Dudes for the Genesis. This time you're saving New York City from a group of assholes after they decide to nuke the city. Great game, great time if you enjoy beat-em-ups.
Now this one is a classic. This game was released in 1982 in arcades as Burnin' Rubber, but the ports of it were called Bump and Jump. It's a vertical racing game that has you jumping over gaps, so it's kind of like 3D Battles of World Runner, but with a car and it's overhead, and as you can see, it's pretty annoying. One thing to say is that many of the Data East arcade titles were ported. Vic Takai managed to snag the rights to the NES publishing, and Bally Midway nicked the rights to the Atari 2600 titles.
It goes without saying that this next game is the staple of what made Data East an incredibly popular company in the arcades. Burger Time is a unique game where you play as Peter Pepper, who goes around stacking burgers killing enemies by peppering them or dropping various ingredients on their head. These enemies include hot dogs, pickles, and eggs. Interesting fact, this game was so successful that Mattel Electronics bought the rights in 1983 and made an Intellivision port. The success of that port led to it being ported to 8 different consoles from 1983 to 1987. A year later, Data East would release a spin-off of Burger Time called Peter Pepper's Ice Cream Factory, a relatively obscure one too. Essentially, it plays very much like Burger Time, but instead of it being burgers, it's ice cream. The more interesting game would be another obscure title called Super Burger Time, which looks about 500% better than the original. The sole downfall is this fantastic song that loops over and over again and over again and over and over.
7 years ago.
It also let you play 2 players, which is fun because it gets hectic.
Unfortunately, many of the future games will be obscure. One example of this would be Diner, the sequel that was released solely for the Intellivision in 1987. But to put things into perspective, 1987 brought us Mega Man, R-Type, Contra, and Punch-Out! So you were a severe late bloomer if you were still playing Intellivision at this point. Burger Time Deluxe would be the next major entry into the series, but it started on the Game Boy in 1991, and it's cool. It's just a much smaller version of Burger Time in black and white, because that's how the Game Boy rocked. Since then, it's been just mostly facelifts or extra features for the baseline title. The most recent iteration was Burger Time World Tour on 2011, but it doesn't exist anymore thanks to Xbox Live Arcade's randomicity in keeping titles in the library. Burger Time is a great cultural reference, and it's still being used. You might have noticed it in Wreck-It Ralph as well. Hell, he was even in Pixels, that really weird Adam Sandler video game movie where Pac-Man eats his father's arm. Yeah, that's a thing.
Do you like Gauntlet? Dark Seal is kind of like Gauntlet, just with strange fantasy characters. For example, a knight, a vampire hunter, a woman who looks like she's from The Great Gatsby, and a ninja. Basically, you have skills and powers, and you can use them to dungeon crawl through all these isometric dungeons that can and will wreck your shit. Because it's an arcade title, right? So they gotta make money. It did have a sequel, but it was not nearly as successful. You can play all of these titles on the Switch or the Data East Arcade Classics disc for the Wii, but if fantasy beat-em-ups are your jam, then please, for the love of God, check out Dungeons & Dragons RPG beat-em-ups such as Tower of Doom and Shadow over Mystara.
There are genres that everyone took the time to have some input on, and most of them contributed heavily to their respective genres. As the name implies, this is a fighting. Capcom had Street Fighter, SNK had Fatal Fury and King of Fighters, Namco had Tekken, Konami had YR Kung Fu, Midway had Mortal Kombat, and Data East had Fighter's History. Fighter's History essentially took the formula for Street Fighter 2, and when we say formula, we mean most of the characters are ripped off, and even the life bars look the same. Quiz time! What happens when you copy assets from an exceptionally successful fighting game that redefined the genre of tournament fighters?
You get sued.
That's right. You get fucking sued. Capcom attempted to sue Data East. And would you believe me if I told you the courts voted for Data East? Yep. The courts determined that the game had elements that were sans en faire. That translates to scene that must be done, which as a policy dictated that if you make a book or song or film, in this case, game, that you can't claim a certain aspect as your intellectual property. So essentially, even though Fighter's History and Street Fighter 2 looked the same, as long as they weren't using names or techniques or certain elements, they would be fine. So you win against one of the most powerhouse companies of the era. But the irony is, the game sucked. Fighter's History is clunky, annoying, and for some ungodly reason was massively popular and maintains a cult following. The big plus was the weak point system, where you could identify a weak spot on the opposing fighter and take advantage of it. But yeah, it's not fun. The boss of the game is Clown and Karnov. Yes, that Karnov. We will get to him in a second.
The sequel would be Karnov's Revenge, and this time it was 900% better. In fact, it was so good that it caught SNK's attention, and it was ported to the Neo Geo. There were some mechanic changes, namely with the 1-2 attack where you could string 2 attacks together from light to heavy or heavy to light, and if you dig it, you dig it. If you don't, then you don't. The final entry would be Fighter's History Misoguchi Kiki Ipatsu, which was a Japanese exclusive Super Famicom title. It featured Chelnov, a key character in another game known as Atomic Runner Chelnov, a horizontal runner game that was heavily criticized because of Soviet imagery. The more you know, right? Speaking of having mandatory entries for set genres, Glory of Heracles is an RPG series. Here's the issue. There's only one game out of the massive library that was released in the United States. For all intents and purposes, this was a Japanese series. It all started with Legend of Fighting Demon's Lair, Glory of Heracles 1987, and it looks like absolute microwave shit! But that's early JRPGs in a nutshell for you. Personally, Ys, Final Fantasy, Dragon Warrior looked a little bit better, but this game just looks like a D&D tile set that went horribly wrong. And the only redeeming moments is that when you're in fights, the sprites are fantastic. I don't know what the hell they were doing or if they just ran out of money after drawing all the monsters, but hey, give it a shot if you like older JRPGs. The story is simple too. Rescue Venus from Hades. No more, no less. The next title was also on the Famicom and was called Glory of Heracles 2, Titan's Downfall. This time they figured out how to make the map look presentable and look somewhat tolerable and could stand up to other popular RPGs at the time. Since this game came out in 1989, that would have been Ys 3, Mother, Phantasy Star 2, and Iron Sword, Wizards and Warriors 2. The third game would be Glory of Heracles 3, Science of the Gods, which follows the story of some random hero having amnesia and has a cool shield that makes him like immortal. In the game, you can sometimes use the special power that turns you immortal, and yeah, it's a gimmick.
Game number 4 would be 1992's handheld entry, Glory of Hercules, the Olympus Offensive. Snap story. The plot is about Hercules who goes on to prevent Cronus from being resurrected because Zeus is being a spicy boy and needs help. This time it was on the Game Boy. To me, it looks like if Pokemon fused with a game about mythology. The combat elements are pretty much also the same. The exception is that unlike the previous title where you could go immortal for a few turns, you could ask the assistance of the gods who would power fuck the enemy. But be careful. You can only enlist the help of one god at a time, which means traveling back to Olympus to swap them out if necessary. The final console entry will be Glory of Hercules 4, Gift from the Gods, and it's based around the story of Atlantis and Pandora's Box. If you're curious, Atlantis has nothing to do with Pandora's Box. However, there is a TV show called Atlantis that had an episode that called Pandora's Box. True story. Anyway, the game is gorgeous and you should check it out. Sorry there isn't much information about Glory of Hercules, so if you want to go play it, go out there and do it. Just do it. Just do it. Don't let your dreams be dreams. Just know it came a long way. The final entry is Glory of Hercules for the Nintendo DS, but it was done by Payon. Here's what it looks like. Got it? Awesome. Honestly, I'd play that. I would really play the hell out of that.
If we attempted to talk about the next franchise, we would be here for 500 years. There are 32 plus games, and they are all micro-vignette graphic novel styled scenarios surrounding the titular Jake Hunter. In Japan, it's known as this Detective Saburo Jinjuji, but I can't pronounce that, so I'm going to avoid it. It all started with Shinjuku Central Park Murder Mystery on the Famicom Disk System in 1987. The game is your standard mystery game. You must visit different areas, ask people questions, and yeah, it's boring, unless you dig that style of gaming. I'm sure there is a translation patch out there somewhere. The sequel came out a year later for the Famicom, called the Yokohama Port Serial Murder Mystery, not to be confused with the Portopia serial murder case, which was one of Enix's first published titles. Same concept. Then, A Dangerous Duo, former part and latter part, two separate titles that came out a year apart, both on the Famicom Disk System. Then they made Let Time Pass By for the Famicom, and then holy shit, we are on the PlayStation! That's right, it's the 90s, and these Famicom titles needed to mix it up a little bit because the rest of the market is evolving. Here's the problem. It's hard as hell to find footage for this game. There would be 2 more entries by Data East before Workjam, Marvelous Interactive, and Arc System Works decided to run with it after the assets from Data East were liquidated. Again, most of this series is in Japanese, so if you are a fluent Japanese speaker, you might have fun with it.
Fortefyre knew I would want to talk about this, but it's only because he's really bad at Joe and Mac. I mean, like, terrible. Jesus Christ. Anyways, Joe and Mac is a platformer that started out in the arcades in 1991. You either play as Joe or Mac, and it's your job to get the ladies back from the bad cavemen. It's an addictive title that was massively popular in the arcades. It was so popular that it had 8 different ports, all of which were massively successful. There was also an SNES spin-off called Congo's Capers, which had a new protagonist called Congo. It's also really difficult and has 35 levels, and it really feels like it's part of the Ghosts and Goblins lineage of titles, but it does handle pretty well. Then it kind of split, kind of like Golden Axe did. We had console sequels, we had arcade sequels. In the console market, we had Joe and Mac 2, Lost in the Tropics, which was a beautiful 2D platformer that handled pretty much exactly the same, but had some role-playing elements, whereas the original one was just an arcade style. The arcade sequel would be Joe and Mac Returns, but it felt kind of like it regressed. I don't know. If you enjoyed the original Joe and Mac, then stick with that. If you want to have a game that looks like Toki did a line of coke off a toilet seat, then play Joe and Mac Returns. But hey, if you really want to have a good time, play the port on the PC. That's the best of them.
This is perhaps one of the most confusing karate games you could play. It's not like the traditional fighting game that you know and love. In this one, you have to use 2 joysticks and use a combination of positions to pull off moves. It has a very steep learning curve because of the 24 different attacks that can be pulled off. Luckily, the cabinet has instructions on it because outside of that, it would be trial and error, and nobody likes trial and error. Well, some people do, but most of us don't. The important thing to know is that this title did inspire various other companies to take a crack at this style of gameplay, such as Konami's Yar Kung Fu and The Way of the Exploding Fist, which practically handles the same. According to an interview with John Tobias of Mortal Kombat fame, this game inspired Mortal Kombat. I don't see that at all. You're full of shit. Full of shit. Like Puzzle Bobble, then you'll love Data East's spin on it called Magical Drop. I absolutely love this game. This is actually a really great time waster, and I find it to be very decent. In Magical Drop, also known as Chain Reaction in the United States, you have cards that you need to swap around to make chain combos to drop blocks in the other opponent's area and essentially out-swap them. It's wonderfully fun, and it's a great time waster. All of these games are the same, so there really isn't a point to describe them all individually. Just know that there are 6 entries in the series, and they are all fucking awesome.
Another vastly popular RPG series for Data East is Metal Max. Metal Max is a long-standing title that started with Createch developing the first entry in 1991 for the Famicom. Basically, it takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where everything is mutated, horrible, and Cronenberged. You collect vehicles that each have slots that you can fit different weapons in. It's monsters versus the humans, and you are the chosen one, Harry. Noah, a supercomputer like Skynet, has fucked up everything, and you must save the day. Metal Max 2, released solely in Japan again in 1993, was on the Super Famicom. It plays almost exactly the same, with a fresh coat of paint and a freedom choice to do anything you want in any particular order. Then the series was rebranded as Metal Saga, which featured 3 games: Metal Saga, Chain of Sandstorm, Season of Steel, and Mobile. Metal Saga would be the first time that the West was able to experience the series. It was developed for us normies by Atlas, but Success worked on the Japanese side of things. Success might not sound familiar, but they did do Metal Gear Solid 2 and Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, so at least you have some idea on who they are. Metal Saga is an interesting game, and for being an RPG, it isn't all that bad. Now, we could explain the rest of the series, but that wouldn't align with what we do here. Data East only really had anything to do with the first game, so if you want to check out the rest of these titles, just know that there are 17 total titles, and for the most part, they're all worth checking out.
We're winding down now. The last 2 series we are going to talk about were titles that really didn't kick off the past first 2 entries. Side Pocket is no exception. It's a pool game. Honestly, pool titles were a niche market, and this was Data East's contribution to that element of gaming. Side Pocket was heavily ported. It started off on the NES, Game Boy, but then transitioned to an enhanced version that was on the SNES, Genesis, and Game Gear. It was followed up by Side Pocket 2, which was a dramatically different title that really looks great. Look at this! For the Genesis, this isn't bad at all, but the real moneymaker was the Saturn version. FMV, baby. The final core series entry would be Side Pocket 3, but only in Japan for the Saturn. There was a spin-off with Pocket Gal, which is an arcade version based on the NES port. Wait, an arcade version of a NES port? Excuse me? Oh, and if you win, you get to see sexy times. Real talk, not full-on bam slam thank you ma'am, but bikinis. There was a sequel to this spin-off called Pocket Gal Deluxe. It's pretty much the same. There was a Pocket Gal 2, but it's just an English translation of Pocket Gal 1.
It's time for some b-ball, yo! More specifically, a Neo Geo basketball series. Street Slam, also known as Dunk Dream, is a really cool basketball series of 2 games, Dunk Dream and Dunk Dream 95. There really isn't that much to say about it because it's a sports game, and it kind of sounds like Dunkaroos, but the one thing we can say is that it's 100% worth your time to check it out if you haven't already. I mean, who could pass up a good little b-ball game on the Neo Geo?
And that's it. Data East was a very popular company in the times of the arcade. As time has gone on, they have slowly drifted out of the spotlight, a fate shared with other prominent companies of the 90s, like SNK. While Data East is just a whisper on the wind, much like every company we have talked about this season, they hold a special place in our hearts. Our childhoods were created by the power of such companies. We have covered so many companies, select genres, and even some franchises too. And now it's time to wrap it all up. The next episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show will be the season finale, and some old friends will come back to talk about their top 5 favorite games. We sure hope you are there to see it, and we also hope you have learned a lot about these time-cherished moments in history.
So there you have it. Pretty short, pretty sweet. I think 45 minutes, maybe even 50 minutes is what this episode capped out at. There's not that much Data East did. They were super popular, and then they went off and fucked off somewhere, right? I mean, there's companies that did that all the time. It's just hit or miss, right? Look at Trade West, look at SNK, look at Sega. Even though Sega's still producing shit, they're not nearly as strong as they were in the 90s. That one decade alone was just a fantastic time for video gaming. I wish I could go back and re-experience it all, because if I had the knowledge I had now and go back then, I'd be a much better gamer than I am today. True story. Anyway, I know we kept saying we're going to talk about Karnov, and I was going to go back and I was going to put a section for Karnov in post, but to be honest, Karnov is stupid as hell, right? So imagine this. This is, you know, probably unprofessional shit, but imagine this. You got one game, Karnov, in the arcades, right? Stupid successful, so you ported to things like the IBM computer, which didn't have that many games ported to it. IBM, Commodore 64, you name it, it was ported to it. And instead of making a sequel, they just say fuck him and his big ass no nipple having titty ass bitch face, and then they start throwing him in cameos, right? He essentially, a strong franchise was relegated to subtle waves on the wind, you know what I'm saying? And outside of Fighter's Revenge, or whatever, Karnov's Revenge, Fighter's History, and, you know, games that have him as references, there's really no point. So I didn't feel the need to make an entire section about Karnov. But anyway, if you like what you saw, give us a thumbs up down in the comment section below. Tell us some companies that you would be interested in learning about, or franchises, or genres. Good chance we'll cover it next season. We've already got all 16 episodes planned. We've got all the guest speakers planned. If we need anybody to fill in, feel free to message me if you're interested in that, because I always love having new people on the team. We have a very strict production timeline, and I know that this episode is about 2 months behind, but with coronavirus and other things going on, a lot of people were in tough situations, so I wasn't that upset about it. But anyway, guys, as always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out. Keep the flames of hope burning and the flames of retro burning even stronger. See you next month, where we have the finale of Ready Go Gaming Show Season 1. Take care.